And while they were speaking to each other's ears, they were unconcerned about the ears listening at their hems, and a lot of great information came out of there. Hercules Mulligan is believed to have gotten the British signal book that their Navy used, and he got that to James Remington, of course, and that's how it got to Alexander Hamilton. And that went into Washington's hands, so the French fleet in Yorktown knew the signals that the British were using and gave them a strong advantage over the British Empire. But Hamilton's efforts to get back into the war had been mostly denied by General Washington. He truly needed Washington at his side throughout the entire campaign for his bureaucratic skills. But Hamilton understood that bureaucrats aren't remembered. And he would not be surprised today that out of all of our founding fathers, he did become one of the least talked about for a very long time. But because of this. But Hamilton decided he was going to get his action in one way or the other. He turned his back on Washington while Washington stood at the top of the stairs demanding he come up and join him in his office. And walked out, and Washington did grant him the privilege of fighting in the Continental Army in Yorktown. They actually had to attack silently when Hamilton's command charged over a hill at Yorktown, attacking the British. So in order to do this quietly, not only did they not fire their muskets, Hamilton ordered his men to unload their guns, so that when they did attack, there was nobody who was going to panic and fire upon them. They attacked only with bayonets. And Hamilton, of course, had a successful victory in this scene, won his military glory, and was, of course, raised to the rank of colonel before the end of the Revolution. So he did achieve pretty great success. Hamilton, of course, didn't stop at colonel after the war. Washington eventually did make him a general during the quasi-war against France. John Adams had a delicate balance keeping us out of war with France shortly after the Revolution. And British and French were going at it, and the French were sacking our ships on the Atlantic Ocean, and things were heating up pretty good. Now, nobody really wanted a war with France, but Hamilton believed that a standing army was the way to go. John Adams called up Washington to reassemble the Continental Army and tore out what little hair he had left in his head when Washington accepted the post and then turned power over to Alexander Hamilton, his aide-de-camp, who had served him so well throughout the Revolutionary War. But contrary to the belief of John Adams, Hamilton wasn't a warmonger. He didn't want war with France. He knew we were a young and fragile country, and he just wanted us to have a standing army to protect ourselves with the threat of an army, not to actually have to use it. Although Hamilton was very much opposed by this by the other Federalists, the party break that ensued would be the death of the Federalist Party later on, Hamilton's true party. It's hard to imagine that this kid from the West Indies could gain the ear of the most powerful man in the country, even before the country is born, and to see it through, and to work with Washington for 22 years of his career, and yet almost be written out of history. The truth is, Hamilton died at a young age, and because of this, he didn't live long enough to write his memoirs, the history to recall his great deeds. I mean, Ben Franklin and George Washington clearly lived to a ripe old age, as did Thomas Jefferson, and the truth is, most of them didn't like Hamilton. He had this very arrogant attitude about him that turned people off. He was always the smartest guy in the room, but he never let anybody forget it for 2 seconds. And the desire to romance every woman under the sun didn't get him a lot of dinner invitations to begin with. He made a lot of enemies, there's no question about it. But his funeral in New York City turned out 30,000 people, which tells you something. Obviously, they may not have liked him, but people respected Hamilton, and heads of state from all over the world turned out. People from all over the country came to New York City to Trinity Church to say farewell to the pragmatic sidekick of General George Washington in 1804. Hamilton, ending up at King's College, where he furthered his education, did take some anatomy classes with a doctor by the name of Samuel Clossy. Samuel Clossy must have been an interesting teacher for Hamilton because he would actually rob graves in New York City to do autopsies inside of his classroom. But Hamilton didn't gravitate towards medicine, he gravitated towards the law. And he wouldn't be able to achieve this until after the American Revolution, because King's College was shut down a year in that Hamilton was a student there because of the revolution. It became the barracks for the Continental Army. But the truth is, Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, was not only fervently religious, he was also fervently loyal to the King of England. And when things got ugly, a riot began to brew outside of King's College, and the crowd was looking to get a hold of the president of the college, Miles Cooper. But Hamilton saved his tail. Hamilton, even though he was no fan of the loyalist president of King's College, talked the crowd down on the steps of the college. He stood outside telling them that they were disgracing their cause through violent actions, unlawful deeds, much like John Adams did during the Boston Massacre. He waved his arms about, but Miles Cooper upstairs, not hearing him over the roar of the crowd, poked his head out the window and yelled, "Don't listen to the little punk. He doesn't know what he's talking about," and tied together some sheets or whatever and lowered himself out the back windows, jumped on a boat, and that was the end of him. He went to England. I'm sure they appreciated him more there anyway, but I'm sure he was a fine educator nonetheless. He did a good job with Hamilton. But Hamilton's fear of mobs saved Miles Cooper from a fate that not many of us would even imagine in a day like today. When we think of a death by tar and feathering, for instance, it sounds very amusing, but it's an extremely horrible way to kill somebody. The tar would slow cook you, first of all. It would seal, and as a result, the feathers would start to squeeze through, push the flesh directly off your bone, your skin would fall off you in slabs. This was not a merciful death. This was a horrible, atrocious crime, and this is one of the things that gave people like John Adams his fear of society at large, left without strong government to regulate them. But they all gave us something. We're here to talk about Hamilton, but you really can't without talking about the indomitable spirit of the American people, from George Washington against all odds, winning the Revolutionary War. Thomas Paine, the ability to gather the masses. It's the common man who fights our common causes. And Thomas Paine, through common sense, united the people. It would have been just rich landowners and merchants grumbling about paying taxes if it hadn't been for common sense. John Adams, fear of people left to their own will. And Thomas Jefferson, a good, healthy fear of government on the opposite end of it. But Alexander Hamilton, like Ben Franklin, who had given us our entrepreneurial spirit and, in many ways, America's sense of humor, even amongst the most serious matters, in America, we tend to smile, laugh, make a joke out of things, and then find solutions to our problems. Well, Hamilton gave us something that's often overlooked. He gave America the ability to recognize that everyone can advance through their own skills, no matter where we come from, what our background is. If we had the intellectual capacity, the ability, and the right moment in history to seize the opportunity, anyone in this country can achieve great goals, greatness in general. And Hamilton is a prime example of how anyone can rise up in this nation and control the seat of power, if not attain it themselves. He's never been the president of our nation, but few people have had more influence over our national character than Alexander Hamilton. Our two-party system in general is a direct result of the opposition of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. You know? Washington trusted him. Jefferson obviously did not. I would not say Aaron Burr, who would eventually kill Hamilton in a duel, was his greatest adversary. By far, I would say it was Thomas Jefferson. But the truth is, Alexander Hamilton did more than just aid George Washington throughout the Revolution. He is the father of modern America. Alexander Hamilton was the reason we had our Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Running the army under weak, loosely run government, Hamilton saw the need for a strong central government, and he's pushed for the convention. He actually had pushed for a convention first in Annapolis, but they didn't get a lot of turnout. But Hamilton got the others to convince to come back and sit down for a second convention. They had to talk about border disputes. They had to talk about the different currencies they were all using in separate countries. There had to be some sort of organization. Money in New York and money in Virginia did not have the same value. So how could you perform trade between the two colonies, or states even, if they were to be considered such later on? So something had to be worked out. He got them all to Philadelphia, and then pretty much pushed out of the rest of the proceedings, had to open up his mouth. Hamilton recommended at the Constitutional Convention that George Washington be elected president for life. Yeah, it didn't go over too well. Washington himself was horrified by the suggestion. Hamilton probably doing it more out of attempting to flatter General Washington than to actually believe it would be a good idea. But as one representative said at the convention, that's all fine if it's General Washington, but what about when it's President Sloshington? Then what are we going to do? And as you can see, we've had some good presidents, some great presidents, and some not so good through the years. Term limits for the